Good morning to everyone and welcome to this roundtable discussion. My name is Faisal Ismail. I'm the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance here at Cape Town at the university. And today I will be moderating this discussion, cotton, textiles, and apparel, regional value chains, and a discussion on the ongoing negotiations on the rules of origin in the African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations. So today we have with us a number of very exciting speakers who've done a great deal of research on trade and trade flows, particularly in cotton and textiles. They have unpacked the issue of rules of origin, which will be discussed today. And they will be discussing the opportunities that are available for African countries to leverage the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to both industrialize and build regional value chains across the African continent. One of the reasons for this initiative was the fact that trade on its own, in our view, is insufficient to catalyze economic development on the African continent. And so we thought we need to build a link between trade and industrialization. And what better way to do it than to engage with high-level thinkers and policymakers on the African continent, together with the negotiators in the AfCFTA. So it's my pleasure today to invite as the first speaker in the first session, Dr. Andrew Mould. Some of you may know him. He has an illustrious career in the United Nations. He has worked in many parts of the world, including in Chile, and studied at Cambridge University and at the University of Complutense in Madrid, where he obtained a PhD. He's published widely, including 2 books, and he's really well placed today to speak about trade and trade flows in cotton textiles on the African continent, on the current flows of trade on textiles and clothing. Andrew, you have the floor. Please proceed.
Thank you once again. My aim here is just to give a bit of an overview for the subsequent discussions. I think it's very important that future policies do not necessarily look like past policies, that there's a lot of changes in this sector. It's a dynamic sector, and technological change is going to come to the forefront in the next couple of decades. So that needs to be taken into account as we design industrial policies and the rules of origin for the AfCFTA. Most technological developments thus far have tended to be in non-sewing operations, so that's either in grading, laying out, or cutting materials, and in warehouse management and distribution. So computer-controlled cutting can reduce time to cut a garment from 1 hour to just 4 minutes. Fortunately for the African continent, for the time being, the sewing of garments accounts for approximately 80% of all labour costs, and experts in the sector tend to suggest that robotisation will probably still remain more expensive than manual labour for the next 2 decades or so. But we have to factor that into calculations as well about the viability of the sector. My second set of considerations here would be regarding environmental concerns, because this is also going to come to the forefront increasingly. Textile and clothing industry accounts for as much as 10% of global emissions, and it has a very large environmental footprint in terms of water usage, chemical use, and energy consumption. And so there's increasing concerns being expressed about the sustainability of the sector. And with this push towards environmental taxes, this is going to become an increasingly important dimension in competitiveness going forward. And my very final considerations here would be about policies towards second-hand clothing. This has been particularly controversial. Trade in second-hand garments globally is estimated around $4 billion in 2019, and Africa accounts for nearly a third of all the global imports of second-hand clothing. And it's been estimated that 80% of all people on the African continent wear second-hand clothes. Now, it's very difficult, of course, for an industry to compete with a subsector which basically has zero production costs. And I think there are probably lessons to be learned here from South Africa, which I understand has banned the import of second-hand clothing, and is the only country, as we saw, with a relatively vibrant clothing and textile sector in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a political economy dimension to all of this. And most economists will stress there will be a very big social cost in this, because it would raise the price of clothing, particularly for the poorest citizens.
So the question we need to move to then is, what role can Africa play as it tries to build regional integration on the African continent? And we have today with us Dr. Caiphus Chakwoti, who is the head of TRAPCA. Caiphus holds a PhD from the University of Dar es Salaam. He has over 25 years experience in conducting training programs and teaching at the university. He taught also at the Makerere University in Uganda, and also worked in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning.
If I'm a manufacturer, and in the textile and clothing industry, what would be my key driver of ensuring that my product becomes competitive? Definitely, that takes you to where you source your inputs and the cost at which you get those inputs. But then on the flip side, our regional integration initiatives, and of course currently now at the CFTA level, expose the need to link trade and industrialization, as Faisal made in his opening remarks. And the way to do that is to then trigger and foster vertical integration within the textile and clothing industry. That can only happen if we bring in the rules of origin plays in shaping the sourcing, and of course then ensuring that the actors in the textile and clothing industry are in a position to think about value addition and think about anchoring themselves on a different nodes of the chain within the textile and clothing industry. We of course can see that rules of origin here and then become an important factor in shaping the sourcing of the inputs. Now, what I'm going to provide, just building on the discussion that and the overview that Andrew has provided in the sector, is to highlight experiences, particularly both from the regional and also specific country cases in textile and clothing with respect to rules of origin, and how that has played out, and what that then means when we look at it from the context of the CFTA and the need to actually foster regional value chains. So I'll start with the work that was done sometime in 2012, 2011 by Brenton and Gilson that actually provided evidence that rules of origin that then require more than one step, more than a change in tariff heading in textile and clothing, appeared to have been a little bit too restrictive for entities that were already providing a product and within the region. And here we can look at the examples in Malawi and also the other SADC countries that were benefiting from supplying the textile and clothing to South Africa. But then double transformation was actually introduced within SACU, but the non-SACU but SADC member states had to comply with that. That immediately implies that entities that, like, for example, Bitsav in Malawi, that were supplying South Africa, needed now to conform to the double transformation. That means sourcing the inputs from within SADC in order to make the textile and the garments to supply South Africa. And that immediately made it difficult because that changed the cost with respect to the inputs. And of course, that has implications on how competitive the product is in terms of the pricing. And some had to cope with that by now relocating to the other SACU member states in order to comply, because then they would easily link up with the manufacturers that were providing the inputs from within SACU. AGOA made it possible for some, a number of the suppliers from the benefited countries to be able to up their exports of textile clothing when the rules of origin was changed to single transformation. And that meant that they could easily then have their products competitive. That was also short-lived, because then that meant that these particular products had to face competition from particularly the Asian suppliers. And what then we witness, and we see that here, is that there was a temporary effect. And that was also reflected with a comparison for the entities that were supplying textile and clothing to the EU, which of course had double transformation as a requirement. And it appeared at that particular point to make it much easier for those entities to supply the US market under AGOA than to supply the EU because of the requirement. Strict rules of origin are important because then it specifies the need to ensure that the entities that are to benefit from a preferential arrangement foster investment by anchoring themselves on the value chain and within the different nodes of the value chain in textile and industry.
Our next discussion, in fact, our next two speakers, Tefere Tesfacho, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the other side of the coin. So far, we've been talking more about the trade elements, and Tefere will be talking more about the industrialization policies and measures, how to support industrialization on the continent. A servant of the United Nations for many, many years, working in Geneva as advisor to the Secretary General and heading the directorates of the Africa and LDC division. And he's back at the United Nations now, having been recalled to work on technology policy.
Slightly in a different direction, but of course within the overall theme of textile and apparel sector and the rules of origin and regional value chains. But I was struck by what you said, Faisal, the other day when we had a dry run. And you were saying that at the end of the day, the purpose of this exercise, this conversation, this dialogue, is to see how we could help negotiators and the ongoing AfCFTA. Key issues that the AfCFTA negotiators should bear in mind, in my view, and you'll see whether they are useful. But I think the first one is something Faisal has highlighted on several occasions, that strategic trade integration is not a substitute for development of productive capacities. I think very, very important. The trade negotiations realize that facilitating or arranging the rules and regulations that will allow trade is one thing, but having something to trade is another thing. It is, goes down to producing products that other countries in the region need for you to export. Going forward, I think this will be important. The AfCFTA is a very, very important initiative for Africa. It's something that must succeed. So while pursuing regional trade agendas through the AfCFTA is very essential and important. What is equally essential is to underline the complementarity roles of industrial policies, and this has been highlighted, but I just want to say it again. At national and regional level, industrial policy, once countries start implementing AfCFTA, they have to start looking inward and say, okay, what is it that I should do in terms of national policy reforms to align their policies with the AfCFTA agenda? So if industrialization across Africa or leveraging AfCFTA to push industrialization drive in the continent is objectives, then not only national level, regional investment policies may be necessary. In Africa, the diversity in the level of development is very, very wide. So it's very difficult how many of these sub-Saharan African countries could actually be participating in regional value chains more than what the trading they're doing now if their product capacity remains at a low level or not developed. Now, but building product capacity takes time, and especially if we say that all these elements must be developed, it takes time. And that's why, as Cyphers was saying, when designing rules of origin, its complexity and restrictiveness have to be considered. Because if you are ambitious and make it strict, because you want to add value in the region, then there will be countries that will suffer from this process, especially, as I say, the countries that produce sort of apparel type of products, and they rely on this sector. Although many of the companies, as Lindsay will tell us, because Lindsay has a very in-depth knowledge of the sector at a firm level in the continent. So the development product capacity and the product diversification in member countries are absolutely critical in the longer term, at least, for regional value chains to develop. Well, of course, in reality, arriving at the type of rules of origin I'm talking about, carefully balanced and to satisfy all concerns, may be easier said than done. But given the fact that the AfCFTA is an ambitious agenda, well, that makes it imperative that we have to look at all options and consider lessons drawn from other experience as well elsewhere to find a solution. And Cyphers was helping us in this respect from the experience different countries in Africa. Well, I think the point is that the weak product capacity of some countries by LDC should be recognized. In my view, I think the single transformation rule will be more relevant for them. The rule should also take into account the constraints faced by firms. I'm sure Lindsay will tell us some of their constraints. I think it's important to make it slightly stringent, enough to protect the sector and value addition in countries with more diversified production system, but flexible enough not to penalize the most vulnerable. That's the point I'm trying to make. Rules of origin, if they are implemented properly, transshipment will not happen. Transshipment happens even when you have rules of origin, but they are not implemented properly, the transshipment will happen. So the institutional development as part of this product capacity building is also important. Let me stop there.
There's no easy answer. There's no easy answer. It's a complex environment. And I think as we listened to the factual and researched presentations earlier, we begin to appreciate that complexity. The instrument itself, rules of origin, it's only a trade policy tool. As you correctly said, on its own, it's not effective, but complemented by industrial policy, supply side support, it could be an effective instrument. But given that African countries are so differentiated in productive capabilities, not only different types of countries, but even, as you say, within countries like Ethiopia, which is 80% rural, but industrializing in some parts. How do we accommodate these differences in productive capabilities, whilst at the same time ensuring that we build a trade policy regime or regulatory regime in the AfCFTA that is supportive of industrialization and regional value chains? Because clearly this is an opportunity which this market, one market, African market, creates to leverage investment and to create a productive base. So you've argued for a careful, inclusive and smart, so that we include those who are less developed, but how do we also move towards a situation where we begin to build those regional value chains and don't undermine the existing more integrated producers on the continent? So a number of things that we have to consider, thinking about formulating a rules of origin, an appropriate rules of origin for the African continent. And there is no easy answer, but as trade negotiators know, nothing is easy. And so as long as we are able to consider all the factors, the complexity, and we understand from the best research available, the data, we can enter into dialogue with each other and create a policy framework within which the negotiators can begin to grapple with how to create a creative, inclusive, and smart rules of origin.
In this session, we will be discussing the creation of backward linkages and regional integration of the cotton and textile sector. I have Lindsay, Professor Whitfield, who will actually be taking us through her understanding and her research that she's conducted in the field. Professor Whitfield is a professor of business and development at Copenhagen Business School and a visiting professor at SASHI, which is the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Joburg. She has conducted extensive research in the cotton and textile sector, specifically in Africa and globally as well. Her research and her study is very field work based, and she's looked at various firm level studies as well as country specific studies, looking at various aspects of the cotton and textile and apparel sectors.
So I just, before getting to sub-Saharan African experiences and what's going on the ground, I wanted to pull out what I think are some really important lessons to learn from other countries. And one of the first things to point out, also from a broader reading of economic history, is that it's really been textile that's driven industrialization and not apparel. Okay, it's been the creation of textile companies the kind of economies of scale and scope, the organizational capabilities that have been gleaned from that, and the ability to create broader linkages within domestic economies and also spillovers into other industries, so inter-industry linkages that have been important. If you look historically, garment assembly itself has had very little to offer for industrialization, even in going back to Britain. It's really been about, especially in the early periods, technological change, the technology that's come with increasingly capital-intensive textile production. Apparel has actually historically always exploited socially marginalized labor. None of the success of Turkey, China, India, and also you can see Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan has been based solely on trade preferences or rules of origin. It's very much been about public support, industrial clusters, and synergies between export and domestic markets. China and India and Turkey, of course, have been historically large cotton producing countries, so they had textile sectors, but it's really the upgrading of these textile sectors that began in the 90s, which made them competitive. So although there's a path dependency, it was public support for upgrading technology in huge capital-intensive sectors that mattered. So when we think about trade policies, we also need to think about how to create synergies. If you create locally textile sectors that are internationally competitive, then you can leverage purchasing power in exports and domestic markets. The way textile sector has driven industrialization in these countries, particularly Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China, has not been linkages to cotton. And I know that's what I'm supposed to talk about, but you'll actually find out that I'm not going to talk much about it. It's actually been the link to the petrochemical industry. Japan was a first mover here, and South Korea and Taiwan followed, and China has done similarly. It's the move into synthetic fabric. It's the inter-industry linkages between the petrochemical industry, textile, and then the ability to create innovations in fabric. Where Taiwan dominates is in its technical textiles, which create higher value added products, but also linkages into other types of plastics, not basic plastics, but quite advanced types of plastics that are used in medical industries and other industries, is where Japan went after basic textile production. So these are the aspects that have really driven, are the causal mechanisms of how textile has driven industrialization. So when we look at sub-Saharan Africa, I want to talk about two experiences, relate them to each other, and then in the last slide say what I think is the way forward. So if we look at Southern Africa, this was talked about also by Cyphus. What we basically see, I should have said the slide I had wanted to add in if I had it here, is that basically there's 6 African countries that export apparel, and that's Madagascar, Mauritius, Lesotho, Eswatini, Ethiopia, and Kenya. South Africa doesn't actually export anymore. So aggregate figures from 1995 sort of weight that in a different way. If we look at a graph now, Madagascar is now the top exporter, then followed by Mauritius and Kenya, with Ethiopia catching up, and Lesotho and Eswatini at the bottom. So this is the group of apparel export countries that I'll be looking at. And the point I wanted to make about the Southern Africa is that we're increasingly see what I call triangular manufacturing emerging. So Mauritius, of course, has an old sector started in the 70s. And as I just said, it vertically integrated into textile. But it quickly had a problem with labor shortage and not just rising wages as well. And now nobody wants to work in an apparel factory if you go there. So Mauritius has increasingly from the 90s, but significantly in the last decade, shifted all of its apparel assembly to Madagascar. But what you see emerging is a sort of division of labor within SADC or SACU, based on a combination of costs, production costs, and local firm capabilities. So Mauritius local firms have moved their garment assembly to Madagascar, some textile, but not, because there's a problem with producing textile in Madagascar. Madagascar then becomes the garment assembly location. Same thing with Lesotho and Eswatini, where this is mostly driven by South African investments with a few foreign firms, many of which are Taiwanese and have connections to South Africa. South Africa becomes a retail market, although it does produce some cotton and some yarn and fabric, but mostly for South African firms operating in Lesotho and Eswatini. And Zambia and Zimbabwe provide some cotton. This is most important for Mauritius. Mauritius actually sources quite a bit of its cotton from Zambia and Zimbabwe. Madagascar does source quite a bit of its textile from Mauritius, 15%, but that's largely for Mauritian firms operating in Madagascar. Madagascar itself has a very limited textile base. Yeah, so you see this sort of division based on a combination of cost and capabilities. The manufacturing base is unevenly distributed. So this is what I'm going to say is I don't think this is where the sort of model that African integration should go towards. It's been somewhat the model that you've seen in Asia and in parts of Asia, but I think there's a different model that Africa could follow and not just follow this textile base in one country, assembling in one country, retail in one country, and cotton in another country. So then I want to look at the experiences in East Africa. Kenya actually has been quite, and I'm going to contrast Kenya and Ethiopia. Kenya has actually been quite disappointing. It was initially the most attractive African country for foreign direct investment under the MFA, and particularly under AGOA because of its infrastructure. But we saw a massive industry contraction after the loss of MFA that rightly, as we've been discussing in the chat box, AGOA hasn't fully, provided enough an incentive for that. So the sector in Kenya is actually really quite small now. I put this here 16 firms just so you can understand that. There are 2 industrial clusters, one outside Nairobi and one in Mombasa. And the foreign firms that stayed are really what we call embedded foreign firms. Many of them are Indian investors from Dubai, and they have a sort of cultural affinity to being based in Kenya. There are very few local exporting firms, and the main lack of competitiveness in Kenya is the absence of a textile base. So there are 1 or 2 firms that are vertically integrated, but mostly they import. And this is really what makes Kenya not very competitive, because if you have to import everything from China and India, you're talking about low lead times, so you can't produce anything of high value or fast fashion. So then they're stuck competing in basic products, which have very low unit cost, and you can only reach 3 to 5% profit margins by operating on a very high scale. I want to point to some global trends, some windows of opportunities, and some policy tools. But if we think about regional value chains and regional integration, I think it's important to take the Ethiopia model instead of the SADC one and think about what the Ethiopia model could do. What we began to see in Ethiopia is the emergence of agglomeration. Textile and accessories will follow apparel. So if you get a critical mass of apparel exporting firms, textile will follow it. So as apparel firms leave Asia because of labor shortages and rising wages, if they move to other countries, then textile follows that. And that's what we've seen with Chinese investments. What we can think about then is creating that kind of agglomeration on a regional scale rather than a national scale. So I think a regional industrial policy to coordinate textile and accessory investments, for example, in COMESA, is possible. I think buyers and foreign suppliers are interested. Buyers are always interested in shorter lead times. My point would be to start with apparel firms, because then you create the demand and you pull in the backward linkages. With a textile base inside sub-Saharan Africa, double transformation rules of origin, are completely possible. But I don't think that setting up the rules of origin is going to make it come. Just like Ethiopia's policy was not to build an industrial park and they will come. No, it liaised with buyers and suppliers first, knew that they would come, and then build the parks. So I think we need to think about building a textile base the other way around. When we think about building this regional diversified textile base, what would it look like? We need to think about creating a TNA sector for the 21st century. What we're seeing is a sustainability shift in apparel global value chains. The figures differ anywhere from 4 to 10%, but the global fashion industry is definitely accounting for a very significant part of greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, transcending planetary boundaries on virgin material use. Buyers know this. They're now seeking to create competitive advantages through sustainability. They're putting new demands on suppliers. A lot of greenwashing scandals where they say they're doing something, but the supplier base isn't meeting it. So if you read the New York Times, there's a huge scandal about organic cotton in India, which is not really organic. But I think buyers are going to push more and more to actually achieving these sustainability goals, and will be looking for suppliers that can deliver this. What are the windows of opportunity for African countries? I think it has to be organic cotton or cellulose alternatives. But the real turn is going to be to recycled raw materials. And there's massive investments in this new tech. And what I think that what we're seeing is we're at the cusp of a new techno-economic paradigm, which people call ethno-modernization. And it provides a window of opportunity for leapfrogging in technology. So rather investing in the old technology, which is mature and leads to high competition and low prices, you invest in emergent technology where African firms can actually be at the forefront and begin to move into technologies where they can capture higher profits and set themselves up at the frontier. And one example of this is also, secondhand clothes can be used to recycle and plastic waste can be used to recycle.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Lindsay. It was very comprehensive in terms of challenging us to think differently in terms of the Southern African model that's been applied versus the model that's been used in East Africa.
Thank you very much, Vuyiswa. At this stage, I would like to invite our discussant, Ms. Winifred Eberechi Ofili, a principal trade negotiator at the Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiators.
First of all, I'll start by reiterating what Andy had said. Andy has done more of the research on where Nigeria stands, and I'm also in total agreement of what he had said to our textile sector due to some of identified conditions that are ranging from insufficient cotton seeds, production high costs, smuggling, and even some of the stakeholders also align those difficulties from most of the free trade agreements that have been into opening up the sector when the sector was not even ready for the competition. So some of this allegation was aligned to what has brought the downfall of the sector. Interventions by the government has been put in place to revive this ranging from an outright ban of importation of textiles. This ban was also part of the measures to see how they can encourage the sector, revive the sector more to stay. And also there's also an establishment of 100 billion cotton textile garment fund by the Bank of Industry. And also there are also programs that are aimed at reviving the country's cotton textile and garments. So this is from the Nigerians' view. And also recently there is an executive order by our president which seeks to compel the use of local products in Nigeria. So all those interventions that have been made to see that this sector is revived. Nigeria have the potential. Yes, we have the potential in Africa.
Well, this has been a fascinating session, the second half, to complement the first. So what are we trying to do, and what has been the purpose of this roundtable today? We've really tried to put as much information as possible in the hands of the negotiators, in the hands of people like Winifred and her colleagues, other policymakers and negotiators who are trying to find a solution on the rules of origin. And of course, others who are also working in the industrial policy space on building their own national industrial strategies, and now given the opportunity to build regional industrialization through regional value chains. I think that we've put quite a lot of data, thanks to both Andrew and Caiaphas, information about trade flows. So pretty much up-to-date data on what are the current flows of trade between African countries and their exports to the rest of the world. I think that the data that Lindsay has put forward also is indicative of future trends about where the industry is going, both how these waves of shifts in production, what is the trajectory of that, but also what she calls the changing techno paradigm, or the changing nature of the content of that production, which is driven partly by climate change and policy changes that are taking place in that space, and how African countries can take advantage of these new trends. I think that we've had a lot of discussion, also led by Tefere Tesfacio, on the role of industrial policy, how governments can support the building of productive capabilities. And now we have the opportunity to do this on a regional scale. So this is the first time we can really apply our minds to how to build this value chain across the African continent, building on the existing comparative advantages and productive capabilities of different countries on the continent. So quite a lot of data, I think, has been put on the table. I don't think that we, as researchers and academics, need to find a very specific set of recommendations on how we solve the rules of origin negotiation. But I think what we have done already is begun to put forward a framework for policymakers and trade negotiators with the necessary data, which they can use to build a creative solution, which take into account some of the principles that Tefere and others have put forward, that we need to take into account the complexity, the different levels of development. We need to be inclusive, and we need to find a smart way forward. This research project is a collaborative one. As you can see from the notice that went out, ODI, TIPS, the University of Johannesburg, and several others not mentioned are participating in this project. We are working closely with the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, which, and all the outputs from this will go to the Secretariat in the spirit of trying to contribute really insights that could help the negotiators as they try to conclude the negotiations on the rules of origin. But that's not the only objective of this exercise. The objective is really to encourage a continuing debate and discussion backed by detailed research on how to implement the AfCFTA in a manner which facilitates the building of regional value chains and industrialization on the continent in a dynamic fashion. So that's really the process that we have started. And we will be drawing on, I think, all those who are interested to work together in collaboration towards this effort. So thanks so much. I hope you have enjoyed this session. I've certainly learnt a great deal myself.